they're fairly through this. There might be a couple that are still filling it out, but let's kind of go through some of this together, and kind of capture this and see what we came up with. What did you guys get as like the overall theme of the chapter?
Omniscience, omnipresence, and able to be everywhere at once.
Okay. Omniscience, omnipresence, and be everywhere at once, which is omnipresence, but that's good. It's worth repeating. It's okay. It's okay.
Search me, O God,
Okay.
and know my heart.
Search me, O God, and know my heart. Okay, what else?
God knows everything.
The attributes of God. That's actually pretty good. What did you say, Aaliyah?
God knows everything.
God knows everything. Yeah. So I titled it, God's full knowledge of us, or the knowledge of God, or something of that nature. Mainly because he starts off with knowledge, but then he kind of ends with, search me and know me, O Lord. He kind of ends with knowledge. But yeah, that's I think all of those are pretty good. So now, the way I'm going to kind of just give you the breakdown of thought. So verses 1 through 6, let's read that. The psalmist says, "O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know my sitting down and you know my rising up." And so he's saying, you've searched me, know me, but you know me when I sit down, you know when I get up. And then he says, you understand my thoughts afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. Now my path, a lot of times today you'll be talking to somebody and say, man, everybody's on their own path in life, man. And so, my path, that phrase there is kind of, a way of saying, you know me when I'm alive, but then you know me when I'm lying down. In other words, you know me when I'm alive, and you know me when I'm pushing up daisies. Okay? And he says, and you are acquainted with all my ways. Verse 4, there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. And so you even know what I'm going to say before I say it. Verse 5, you hedged me behind and before, and you laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, and I cannot attain it. But then he says in verse 7, where can I go from your spirit? Now, does verse 7 fit with those first 6 verses? No. So, the first 6 verses would be the natural break of thought. Why? Well, because verses 1 through 6, whether it's using the word know, or using the word comprehend, or understand, or synonyms like that, acquainted, those are all words for the same thing. Those verses are all talking about God's knowledge, right? The knowledge of God. And so in my outline, that's kind of what I write. I write, God's knowledge, or the knowledge of God, or if I wanted to be Bible college about it, I'd say omniscience, which just means God is all-knowing. Okay, but that's what it's saying. There's nothing about you that God does not already know. And so the psalmist says, you know everything. You know me. You know my path that I'm on, and the implications kind of the path that I'm on. Even before I know the path. And you know when I'm lying down. He says you even know my words before I say them. Because there are some people who think that God doesn't know everything. There's some people who think that God doesn't know what you're going to say, or God doesn't know what you're going to do. But these verses seem to say, no, God knows everything. Now here's this is for free. I'm not going to charge you for this. But just a kind of a bonus verse, Psalm 90, verse 9. Psalm 90, verse 9. We'll put that up on the screen. Psalm 90, verse 9. We spend our years as a tale that's already told. God already knows our life before we live it. He already knows the story of our life. He knows the end of our life before we had a chance to even start the beginning of it. Why? Because He knows everything. We live our lives like a tale that's already been told. It's the knowledge of God. Okay? But then in verse 7 of Psalm 139, the psalmist goes on and says, where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you're there. If I make wings in the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. And so far he's saying, I go to heaven, you're there. I go to hell, which a better translation of that is grave. Some of your Bibles just in your center column will actually tell you that. You'll have like a little Roman numeral, and it'll say like Sheol, or it might say grave, or it might say Sheol, which can be translated grave from the Hebrew. Okay? So you didn't have to look this up. It's just there's a little Roman numeral or some kind of mark right next to that. The reason for that is back in the King James day, they just translated grave and hell the same thing. So oftentimes it just kept continuing to stick in the English Bibles. So he's not saying God's going to hell. It's saying that he knows you if you're alive, and he knows you if you're dead. And in this particular case, now David's saying, you know what? There's nowhere you can go. I can go to heaven and you're there. I can go to the grave and you're there. He says, if I take wings in the morning, if I fly up in the air, you're there. But if I go down in the next verse to the bottom of the sea, there you are. He says, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely darkness shall fall on me, and night shall fall, and night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide me from you, but the night shines above the day. And darkness and light are both alike to you. He's saying, you know what? I can't even hide in the darkness. You're there. I can't hide in the light. You're there. Everywhere I go, there you are. But then in verse 13, he says, you formed my inward parts. Now, does forming my inward parts, you know, my organs, my lungs, forming my inward parts, does that fit with running away from God? You know, where can I go from you? Where can I flee? So this is another thought. So this should have been in your outlines where you broke up another verse. So you have verses 1 through 6. You got verses 7 through 12. Now, what would I have called verses 7 through 12? God is everywhere. Omnipresence. Omni meaning, you know, all. Presence meaning like presence. He's all present. He's everywhere. There's nowhere where God can't be. Okay? And so David is realizing that. If there's nowhere I can run to, so why bother running? I cannot escape you. Okay? But then, verse 17, verse 13, my finger got moved. I was like, why did I say? Verse 13, you formed my inward parts, and you covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, those two verses go together, right? You formed me, he says, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And then he says, in verse 15, my frame was not hidden from you. That's my skeleton. You know, I was made in secret. You know, that still fits, right? He's made my skeleton, he's made my inward parts. Verse 16, he says, your eyes saw my substance, yet being unformed. You know, so with what, you know, the abortion doctor would like to call just a fetus, God says, you know what, I knew you then. And I formed you, I made you. Okay? And then this is interesting, he says, and in your book, they are all written. The days are fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. But God's saying, you know what? Not only did he make you in your mother's womb, but before you were even in your mother's womb, he ordained every day of your life. He knew what you were going to do every single day of your life until you didn't have any more days of your life left. He numbered your days. He ordained your days. Now, there are some people who believe that God doesn't do that. And God says, I beg your pardon, I do this. But then, he says in verse 17, how precious are your thoughts to me, O God. Now, does that fit with forming in the mother's womb, with the previous section? So obviously, now we're into another section. So what would we have called verses 13 through 16? Huh? Being made, okay.
God's thought.
God's what?
God's thought.
Not yet. That'd be the next section. Yeah, God made us.
God created us purposely.
God created us purposely. I like that. God knows me. Okay. I put on there, God designed me. I put God's sovereignty because he created me and he appointed all my days. And so, so I'm seeing the creation of God, but I'm seeing the sovereignty of God. God is, he made me, but he has ordained the days of my life. He's in control of it. He made me with a purpose. He's designed me. He is sovereign over my life. So yeah, he's the creator, but I'm also seeing him appointing the days of my life. And so for me, and I'm not saying that God, for those of you that say, God created me, that's wrong. I think that's exactly right. I just saw a little bit more in my outline. I saw God's sovereignty because He created me with a design. He created me with a purpose, and He ordained every day of my life. Why? Well, because as it said in the first section, He's all-knowing. He can do that sort of thing. Now, verse 17, it says, how precious are your thoughts toward me? How great is the sum of them? If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. But then he says, oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Now, do those sound like they go together? How precious are your thoughts towards me, but bash their teeth in. Right? I mean, clearly this should have been a section break on your outline. If you grouped verse 17 and 19 together, we need to talk. So verse 17 and 18, what would you have called that? Sharon shouted it out earlier. Sharon, what would you call that?
I call it God's thoughts.
Yeah, God's thoughts, the thoughts of God. God's thoughts towards me. Okay? Now verses 19 through well, let's see. I won't tell you. I almost told you. Verse 19. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloodthirsty men, for they speak against you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God. Does that fit? Clearly another break, right? So you shouldn't have been done with your outline quite yet. So this one section, 19 through 22, what would you call that?
God's enemies are my enemies.
Okay, God's enemies are my enemies. Yeah, so I put on there the enemies of God, and kind of, but listen, this is a tough principle for people to get, but there's an idea that you hate what the Lord hates, not who, what. For example, Psalm 97 verse 10, it says, you who love the Lord hate evil. If you really love God, then if He hates sin, you're going to hate sin. If He hates divorce, like His Bible says, He hates it because of what it does to people, what it does to children, what it does to the human heart. He hates that. He hates the destruction of it. And so if Malachi says God hates divorce, well then as someone who loves the Lord, we should feel that way. No, we don't hate divorced people. We have compassion on them. But we hate what divorce does to people. And so you who love the Lord hate evil. Psalm 97 verse 10. Likewise, in Revelation chapter 2 verse 4, Jesus is talking to the church in Ephesus that lost their loving feeling, if you will. And their first love. And he's confronting them about the fact that they lost their first love, but then he praises them. He says, but this you have, in Revelation chapter 2 verse 4, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans. He didn't say that you hate the Nicolaitans. You hate what the Nicolaitans do. But then he says, which I also hate. This is meek, mild, loving Jesus saying that He hates the deeds of the Nicolaitans. I can give an old big Bible study on the Nicolaitans, where let's just say that they were a legalistic, heavy-handed cult that were deceiving people. And so He hated seeing people get deceived and ripped off by these people. But the point of the matter is, that we hate what the Lord hates. Oh, I don't know, but hate's not a family value. Well, you know what? It's a biblical value if you're hating the right thing. If you hate sin, but still love people who commit sin, then you're okay. It's okay to love somebody who's in sin and love them and care for them and have compassion on them and hate what the sin is doing to rip them off and destroy them and hurt them. That's how God feels about it. So we kind of see that in this outline. Now verses 23 and 24 in Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart and try me, know my anxieties, and see if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. What would we call this? Know my sin and what? Heal me? Okay, sorry, just couldn't hear you. Okay, what else? Anybody? What's that? Okay. Search me. I put being, examined by God. search me or examine me. Basically, God, because I live in a sinful world, search me and make sure that I'm okay. I don't want to. I want to be one of the ones that you have precious thoughts toward. I don't want to be one of the ones that you have wicked thoughts toward. I don't want to be one of the evildoers and one of your enemies. So search me. God, I want you to come into my heart and search it and examine it. And if there's any iniquity, if there's any sin, then deal with it. Because I don't want to be on the hate category. I want to be in the precious are your thoughts category. So search me. Okay, so that's kind of how you would outline this. Now, quickly, let's talk about parallelisms. Took a little bit of time for everybody to kind of work through this. I'm going to try to cover parallelisms quick, realizing that you have this written in front of you. So now, poetry, again, is all about thought. So you're finding the main thought, and then there's figures of speech and analogies and that sort of thing. And so you're always going to try to interpret the figure of speech the way that the author intended the figure of speech to be interpreted, okay? Like we did with parables. Now, one way we do that, one of the ways that we would interpret a figure of speech in poetic writing that is unique to poetic writing, that's different than the way we handle things with parables, is that we look for what's called a parallelism. Because I can't say it really fast, because it comes up parallelism. So there's three different types in your handout. There's three different types of parallelisms to watch for. Okay? Number one is called synonymous. Synonymous, which just means same. Synonymous parallelisms. And then number two is synthetic parallelism. It doesn't mean fake. Synthetic parallelism. And then number three, antithetic parallelism, which basically means opposite. So synonym or synonymous, synthetic, antithetic. So let's define this. A synonymous parallelism is basically a thought that's then expressed or communicated a second or third time in a very similar way. Now, oftentimes it'll be repeated verbatim, word for word, but sometimes it's not exactly word for word. Make sure you pay attention to this part because you'll miss it. It's not exactly word for word, but it's similar. It's close. So you don't have to find it word for word identical, but you find one thought communicated one way, and then it's repeated, not quite word for word, but very similar. That would be a synonymous parallelism. Now, let me give you two examples of what a synonymous parallelism would look like in the Bible. So, in your handout, Psalm 51, verse 2. The psalmist says, "Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity," and then he says, "and cleanse me from my sin." Now, I didn't have to change verses. I didn't have to compare 5 or 6 different verses. Right there in that one verse, I see a synonymous parallelism. Because on the one hand, he says, "Wash me from my iniquity," and now he uses synonyms that mean the same thing. So he's saying the same thought, just a slightly different way, and he says, "and cleanse me." Cleanse means wash. "Cleanse me from my sin." Sin is the same thing as iniquity. So one says, "Wash me," and the other one says, "Cleanse me." One says iniquity, the other one says sin. This is a synonymous parallelism. Okay, Proverbs 17:28. "Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he's considered perceptive." This is my life verse. Evidently, it's yours too. So on the one hand, he says even a fool is counted wise. A fool looks wise if he just shuts his mouth, if he holds his peace. And then he says basically the same thing. If he shuts his lip, shuts his pie hole, then he's considered perceptive. So he says the same thing, almost verbatim. It's not exactly verbatim, but it's the same idea. That's a synonymous parallelism. So don't always look for word exact verbatim. But you might find synonyms. But what you're looking for is the same thought, but it's repeated, and it seems to be, the same thing, just slightly different, okay? That's synonymous. Synthetic parallelism. Now, this is when the author states an idea, and then he adds to that idea. So he states an idea, and then he kind of builds on that original idea. Here's an example. Psalm 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man who walks in the counsel of the ungodly, so here's kind of a contrast, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. And so we went from a godly man walks, but we have ungodly men who, you stand in the path. And then eventually you sit, but you see this progress. And so you could if you're not careful, you go from walking with the Lord, walking in the counsel with the Lord, so he's saying, don't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. Okay? So don't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. So you can walk with the Lord, or you can walk in the counsel of the ungodly, but you don't even want to stand in the path of the sinner, and you don't even want to sit in the counsel. Okay, so in a real world application, if you're a teenager, somebody might say, hey, just come and party with us. Well, I don't want to drink. I'm a Christian. I don't want to. We don't have to drink. Just come and party with us. Just hang out with us. Well, that's kind of like sit with the scornful. Oh, you don't have to do anything. Just hang out. Well, if you're sitting with them, it won't be long before you stand with them. And now that they're all drunk and they're all up, now they want to get in a fight and they want you to stand with them. And then you keep doing that week in and week out, and before you know it, now you're walking in their ways. You're walking in their counsel. So there's this progression that takes place. I read it wrong the first time around, by the way. So blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat. So you see a progression. It's kind of building. Okay, so that would be synthetic. So if you see something where one thought's communicated, and then it keeps adding to it or builds on it, that's synthetic. Any questions on that? Because I kind of filtered that one up for a second or five. Okay, number 3, antithetical parallelisms. This is when an author is just contrasting one thought with another thought. So you want to watch for contrast words. So he's just going to contrast something. So an example would be Proverbs 17:9. He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. And so, man, your friend shares something with you, and you keep it to yourself, and you don't share with anybody, no matter what it's about, no matter who you think needs to pray for them. And you're like, you know what? God knows. I don't need to share this prayer request. This is personal. Well, you're doing that out of love. You love this person. You care for them. But the moment you start blabbing, the moment you start sharing, one day it's going to get back to them, and it's probably going to end your friendship because they trusted you with that information. And so, but you have here's antithetical. He takes one thought and then he contrasts it with the opposite version of it. But it's still the same thing, still the same message, the same lesson that's being taught. So he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. So you're going to want to watch for contrast words. And that doesn't mean every time you see the word but, that it's always a contrast. Because in the passage that we dealt with here, there's some contrast words, but there are no antithetical parallelisms being used in this particular passage, even though the word but's being used. So it's not, just because you saw the word but doesn't mean it's a contrast. The context is going to tell you if it's a contrast. You're going to read it, and go, oh, that was a word that signals a contrast, and then when I read the rest of the sentence, it was clearly a contrast. Okay, so I'm just kind of get hung up just because you saw the word but. So what we want to do right now is we want to try to go back, and I'm going to do this with you because we don't have a lot of time, and I kind of want to show you this. But we're going to go back and look at what the parallelisms be. It's okay that I rushed this because the most important part of this was for you to learn how to outline, for you to find the thoughts, because that's how poetry is written. Poetry is written by a pattern of outlines. So if you just find where the outline breaks are, you're going to be okay. Now this next step is helpful, and it is worth learning, but it's going to take a little bit of time to learn how to identify some of this. So, you want to watch as you're doing this for figures of speech, and you want to try to figure out, as we read this passage, what parallelisms might be used. What we mean by that, we want to try to figure out if it's a synonymous parallelism, we want to figure out if it's a synthetic parallelism, or we want to figure out if it's an antithetical parallelism. So we're just going to go back to our outline. So everybody just go back to the outline that you did. And then we're going to kind of look at these verses. And so we know in verses 1 through 6, that section dealt with God is all-knowing. the omniscience of God. And so verse 1, again, it says, "Oh Lord, you've searched me and you know me. You know my sitting down and my rising up." What kind of parallelism do we think we might see in verse 1? You've searched me and you know me. Synonymous. Because he's not building anything. You search me and you know me. Okay? And then he says, you know me when I'm sitting down and you know me when I'm rising up. And he says, you understand my thoughts from afar off, and you comprehend my path of life and my lying down. So there's no real progression necessarily. What you're seeing is different ways of saying kind of the same thing. Because earlier he said, you search me and you know me. He says, you know me when I sit down, you know me when I rise up, you know when I'm sitting and sitting. He says, you know me whether I'm living or dead. You know my path, you know my lying down. Verse 4, he says, "For there's not a word on my tongue. Behold, O Lord God, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before." And this one's a little tougher. "And you've laid your hand upon me." Any stabs at that? It's still synonymous. It's a little tougher, but the outline hasn't changed. We're still in the same verses, right? So the outline hasn't changed, and we've kind of identified that he's using some synonymous parallelism, because nothing's building. He's not saying, sit, stand, walk, or stand in the counsel of the godly, sit. There's not like this building of things that are taking place, as much as you search me and you know me, and here's how you can search me when I'm sitting down and you still know me. Whether I'm standing up, you still know me. Whether I'm alive on the path or whether I'm lying down, I'm dead. You know me. So he's not building on this concept. He's not adding to it. He's stating the same thing in different kinds of ways. Now, verse 7. "Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence?" Synonymous. Because go and flee would be the same thing, right? Where I go from your spirit, where can I flee? Okay. And so then he's illustrating that, and he says, "If I ascend to heaven, you're there. And if I make my bed in hell, behold, you're there." Still synonymous. It's the same thing, just two different ways. Kind of like what we had talked about with our example when he said, "Wash me from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." Okay? He says, if I take the wings in the morning, or if I dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, so if I'm up or down, and he says, even your hand shall lead me, your right hand shall behold me. So your hand leads me, and your hand beholds me. It's still synonymous. He says, "Surely darkness shall fall on me, even night shall be light about me, and indeed the darkness shall not hide me from you." And so he's still kind of throwing the same thoughts side by side. Okay, but now we go to verse 13, and sorry, I just lost verse. There we go. "For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made." What do we see in those two verses? Okay, so he says, "You formed me. You formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb." Okay, so if you form my inward parts and then you cover me in my mother's womb, it's still kind of the same thing that's happening, right? I'm in my mother's womb and he's making my parts at the same time. Okay? "I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works that my soul knows very well." "I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made." So I praise. And then he says, "Marvelous are your works, that my soul knows very well." Isn't that the same thing, just worded two different ways?
Yeah.
One, he's praising him, and now he's, marvelous are your works, and praising him some more. Okay? He says, synonymous, exactly, good job. He says, verse 16, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. So, he wasn't hidden from God, he was made in secret, and he was skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. There's two synonymous ideas still being cast side by side. Okay? Then he says in verse 17, how precious are your thoughts toward me, O God. How great is the sum of them. That's what's tricky. If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand in the sea. When I wake, I am still with you. What do we think is going on in these two verses?
I think synthetic.
What's that? Synthetic. And Don said adds to it. Yeah, I think he's adding to it. He starts off, you see this progression, kind of a reverse progression. He starts off with the sum, and then he kind of breaks down how he got to the sum. He says, here's the sum of them, and then he says, if I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. So you almost see like, in my mind, I see a reverse progression. I go from the sum to the math, if you would. But in fairness, I struggle with it, and the first time I outlined this, I said it was synonymous. Second time I outlined it, I said it was synthetic. The third time I outlined it, I said it was synonymous. The fourth time I outlined it, I said it was synthetic. I was like 50-50 on this. So I won't, I won't hold it against you if you're just like me. So, verse 19 and 22, he says, oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloodthirsty men. You said it's opposites? So at verse 19 at the beginning, who is he talking to? He's talking to God, but about who? Wicked, right? Then at the second part of verse 19, he says, depart from me. Now, is he telling God to depart from him? He's telling the wicked, the earlier group, right? The wicked. Now he's just calling them bloodthirsty men. It's a synonym for the same group. You're going to find that if it's synonymous, it often uses synonyms. So he's talking about the same group of people, just two different ways. He calls them wicked men and he calls them bloodthirsty men. For they, who's the they? The wicked, bloodthirsty men. For they speak against you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain. Same thought, two different ways. They speak of you wickedly, or they take your name in vain. To take his name in vain, they have to speak. Same thought, two different ways. Okay, so I would call that section synonymous. And then the last two verses, search me, O God, and know my heart. Okay, what would we call that? Search me and know me. Synonymous. He says, try me and know my anxieties. Still synonymous. See if there's any wicked way in me, and then lead me in the path everlasting. And so I would sum up that those last two verses, that last little section would be synonymous. And what you'll find, typically, is that most chapters will be, either synonymous, like the whole chapter, or synthetic or antithetic. Now, there'll be a little bit of mixture. There will be because sometimes there's a pattern. Now, sometimes the pattern is that this whole poetry, this whole chapter, is all synonymous. That was the pattern that the author was using. Sometimes it's all synthetic. That was the pattern. Or sometimes it's all antithetic. There's 7 things that the Lord, hates, but 6 things that the Lord hates, but 7 that He loathes, or whatever. And he kind of does these things. And so you try to find the pattern. But even within this, you might find that in this one, you might find the majority of them were synonymous, but maybe one was synthetic. Now here's the thing: maybe it wasn't. There's always a possibility that because the majority of the passage was synonymous, and one little section you thought was synthetic, but you were struggling with it and thinking, well, maybe it was synonymous, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was synonymous because the rest of the chapter was. But for the most part, what you found was that poem, the pattern of thought, was a synonymous parallelism. And so when you're trying to handle poetry, you're trying to find the pattern of thought. You find the pattern of thought first by outlining it, breaking it up by its thoughts. Then when you break it up by its thoughts, you look for, is it the same thing being said two different ways? That's a synonym, synonymous. Or is it something that's being added to and built on, that's synthetic? Or is it a contrast? Well, that's antithetical. And now I've kind of solved this mystery of the poem, and I now see that, okay, this is the pattern that the author was using. Then once I've made those observations, then I can start applying some of those principles to my life. I can start interpreting first, then apply the principles to my life. Is it kind of clear as mud? So trying to find the parallelism is difficult. It takes some practice. It takes a little bit of time. It's not always easy. I mean, some of them are just like that. I mean, like, oh, that was easy. And some of them are like, ooh, I think that might be synthetic synonymous. And it takes a little bit of doing it. But it's important that you do it because, again, poetry is all over the Bible. It's in the book of Exodus. It's in Ezekiel. It's all over the place. It's even quoted in the New Testament. And so if you want to understand all of God's Word, you've got to know how to handle it the right way. And so again, your first day, maybe you just read the passage. The second day, you just kind of go through and just break it up by its thoughts. I mean, I read a proverb a day anyway. The Proverbs are all poetry. So, because it works out, there's sometimes 30, sometimes 31 days in a month, so I read a proverb a day. And then you can just break it down, break it up by its thoughts. So anyway, that's that. So this is, that's in a nutshell how to study the Bible. When you get confused, just pull out your worksheets, kind of look at the definitions, maybe go back online and watch the archives, try to look at that, or Google if there's somebody smarter out there to help you with this, besides me. But that's kind of what you want to do. Any questions on this?
I think Sharon said, or call you.
Or call me. It's okay. I won't answer. I mean, yeah. Any questions before you move on? All right. Well, that's it. Thanks, guys.